Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
For nearly as long as there have been movies based on books. But there's a reason the expression, the book is better, has never entirely gone out of fashion. On this week's episode, Katie and I discuss the art of adaptation, and why it's maybe not so easy to turn that beloved page-turner into a masterpiece of the screen.
Welcome to Film Club. Dowd, as an awards consideration, there is a difference between an adapted and an original screenplay. That's been part of the Oscars since the very beginning, since 1929. They've had two separate categories. And I think it's interesting that the WGA Awards, the Writers Guild Awards, people who write screenplays for a living also make the distinction. I mean, not all awards ceremonies do. The Golden Globes, the Independent and Spirit Awards, for example, don't make distinctions between adapted and original. But when it comes to awards that are voted on by screenwriters, there does seem to be a distinction made between the art of writing an original screenplay and the art of adaptation. And what I'm really interested in is some process, but we're not screenwriters, so we only have so much insight into that, but also how it's different creatively. We see all kinds of different adaptations in terms of writing. Most common is novels, and then you've got nonfiction articles, video games, and now with Zola, tweet threads have entered the conversation of things that can be adapted. And I actually thought Zola was a pretty good adaptation, but we'll concentrate on books today, though. Now, I know you have some thoughts about the challenge of adapting a novel for the screen that is, I think it is arguably a creative challenge.
Oh, big time. I mean, if you think about screenwriting, I think that writing an original screenplay is a lot like taking kind of a lump of clay and building something out of it. Mm-hmm. You take this raw material, which is, something from your imagination, and you build it into a coherent piece of work. I think often with adapting something, with writing a screenplay that is based on previous material, maybe especially novels, I think of it more like you're kind of chipping away at a block. That there is already this existing work, and you are trying to make something different out of it with what exists already. Right.
And there are, a lot of elements in novels that don't necessarily translate well to the screen. Novels are great for interiority and getting inside a character's head and that kind of perspective, and that's significantly more difficult to do in a film.
Yeah, I mean, filmmakers have been finding kind of easy and convenient ways to get around that aspect for years. I mean, voiceover is the one that I feel like is cited the most often.
That's the easiest way.
It's the easiest way. And sometimes, in fact, when you're adapting a novel, I feel like the writer will just take passages of first-person musings and narration from the book and turn it straight into voiceover. And that's obviously the easiest way. And I think sometimes it's a very poor substitute for the interiority that a novel can provide through prose.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And most of the time when you're using a lot of voiceover like that, a lot of the time it drags down the movie too. It's hardly ever an asset, honestly.
Well, we could do a whole episode on that, honestly, because I do think there are lots of very creative and very interesting uses of voiceover. I think there are filmmakers who are excellent at it. I mean, I think about somebody like Charlie Kaufman, a kind of an adaptation expert in some ways, or at least one who has some really radical ideas about how you can transform a pre-existing work into a movie. He handles voiceover, I think, really well. I think it ends up being a crutch, I think, for a lot of filmmakers, and I think we could do a whole episode about that. I think, but I think the issue of interiority is big because I think a lot of the time when you're reading a novel, something that prose can offer is it can offer this kind of direct window into what a character's thinking in a really organic, natural way that movies have to movies have to fight a little harder to make that interior space legible to us.
Well, and part of that is making that interior space visual. Mainly you think about adaptation in terms of writing, but for a director, there are challenges there too. There's imagery in novels and then kind of atmosphere and tone. That's all the director's challenge to bring that to the screen.
Yeah, I mean, something that I think you'll see a lot is there will be a work that's highly symbolic, and that is, I think, easier for a filmmaker to take a look at that piece of work and grab elements that become easy visual symbols.
Mm-hmm.
We talked this summer about The Green Knight,
Mm-hmm.
based on the very old Arthurian poem, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one where I feel like the filmmaker, David Lowery, kind of looked at the text and said, what is interesting here and what interests me here? And said, there is a lot of... There is a lot of symbolic and metaphoric value in this work, and that is going to be the focus of my adaptation, you know?
Yes. Yes. And I think that is a good way of approaching it, particularly what you said about what resonates with me,
Mm-hmm.
like as the filmmaker in this work. Because honestly, a lot of the times when we talk, okay, so like what makes a good adaptation or a bad adaptation, right? Mm-hmm. To me, a lot of what makes a bad adaptation is when things are overly literal. Like when a adaptation is too slavish. It includes things that don't necessarily translate that well to the screen, or it doesn't seem to mean much. Like the way that they tailor the story doesn't mean much of anything. And there's an example of this. I don't know if many people listening will have seen this movie because it was a Netflix movie, and those always kind of come and go. But there was a movie that came out back in April with Amanda Seyfried on Netflix. It was called Things Heard and Seen. Now, that film was based on a book that came out in 2016 called All Things Cease to Appear by Elizabeth Brundage. And the adaptation, it was the filmmakers that made American Splendor who did that adaptation. And the thing about it is, I didn't read the book, but I could tell that it was an overly literal adaptation in the sense that there would be shots in this movie that they would cut away to, say, like a crow sitting on a branch. And I imagine that in the novel that was an evocative symbol that was worked into the prose, but the adaptation didn't incorporate any of that. It just took the literal story. And so they seemed like random cutaways. Do you know what I mean?
Sure, of course. I think it's very easy to tell when a filmmaker has taken, when there's something missing, when something is lost in translation, even if you have not read a book. I think movies that are based on books that are, especially books that are big and thorough and involved and very long, sometimes it can be very easy to tell when there's something that remains in the film, something that's been brought over from the screen to the page, that where the filmmaker has not necessarily found the significance of this thing, or there is something missing from something gets lost when it moves from one to the other. I think that's a very easy thing to tell, even if you have not read the book.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, we see a lot of, I feel like you and I see a lot of adaptations of books, because the reality is that's like Hollywood gets a lot of its ideas from literature, and that's been true for the entire history of the medium. And to one respect or another, is that we've been adapting books into movies for a very long time, and I one of the things I notice on the regular is I will get this feeling watching something that this thing must have worked better in its original format, because you can sort of tell that it's missing a certain depth of characterization, a certain depth of ideas when it's brought to the screen. Because I think the worst adaptations in some ways are just sort of these kind of dead blueprints of the work, like they have followed to a T what's in the novel, but they haven't necessarily captured what makes that work.
Exactly. They follow the plot, but they don't follow the spirit of the book, or like the theme or the message of the book. That gets lost because they're overly concentrated on the plot.
Which is not that's not a new phenomenon by any means, but I do feel like the last couple decades have really exacerbated a concern about fidelity and a concern with being as close to the text as possible. You see it a lot more in modern comic book blockbusters, for example.
Right. There is the fan
comics.
Culture.
Right. Like we are constantly catering to fans so that they don't revolt, and giving them a faithful version of the thing they loved. And it's been interesting to see some of those discussions over the last couple decades. And I think back about 20 years ago, obviously, to when both the first Harry Potter adaptation came out, and also when the first of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings came out. And I think those are both examples of filmmakers who are taking massively successful and popular fantasy works and sticking pretty close to what's on the page, But I think in the case of the Potter adaptation, that is a case, I think, and the series would eventually diverge a little bit from the faithfulness. But that is a case of somebody who read that book and said, let's just get as much of this as possible right up there on screen without any real consideration of, is this essential? Will this play in the new medium? They just said, we need to blueprint this. This is how popular Harry Potter is. We just need to photocopy this book and put it on screen. Whereas I think with Lord of the Rings, Jackson was being faithful while also deviating in ways here and there.
I mean, I'm going to risk offending any Harry Potter fans in the audience. Lord of the Rings might be a richer text than Harry Potter that way.
Right.
You know, there might be more to pull from in a Tolkien book.
Well, but I mean, I will say something. Having read the first couple Harry Potter books, I'm not like a giant fan of the series. I've seen all the movies and I've read the first couple books. They are written in a way where it's they feel adaptable immediately. Reading it, and that's not always, you know, that isn't necessarily an insult. Some books are simply written in a way where it's very easy to read them and visualize what the screen adaptation will be. I think Stephen King writes in that way as well. I think there's a reason that so many of his books get adapted is that he has a very visual sense of writing. He creates images in your head, and that makes the job, that's the screenwriter's job, that much easier.
You know who else's work was highly adaptable and, you know, the results showed was Michael Crichton. His books were very much like that too.
Yeah, although it's interesting because I think that Crichton's books, when you're adapting his, I think the set pieces are all there on the page, but his writing, if you've ever sat down and read a Crichton book, you do have to like sort of wade knee deep through a lot of pretty tedious science jargon.
Yeah, he was a doctor, so he was really hung up on the technical aspects of all this stuff.
You get like, I mean, some of his novels too are just like, I remember reading his one about airplanes, which is Airframe, is that what it's called? I'm now.
Oh, I didn't read that one.
This was a couple decades ago at this point, and just feeling like, wow, I really got a sense of how the inside of a plane works. Not a huge shocker that this one didn't get adapted. You know,
for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, to bring it around to the idea of being overly slavish in your loyalty to the text, I think an adaptation that did that dead blueprint thing that you were talking about in a way that both of us didn't like was Zack Snyder's Watchmen.
Yeah. No, that is an example of somebody who has done everything in his power to replicate the work, sometimes panel per panel, sometimes often scene for scene. There are a few changes throughout that, I mean, I'm sure we could get into this in with a fine-tooth comb if we wanted to. But the fact of the matter is that is a very faithful adaptation of the graphic novel Watchmen, and also one that I feel like even as it's replicating this thing scene for scene, completely misses its point. You know? Yes.
It's got the exact same plot, but it completely missed the point. I felt the same way when I saw it. Yeah.
Well, because how you present something is sometimes more important. Roger Ebert once said, I'm more interested in not in what a movie's about, but how it's about, is what he would say.
Right.
And I think how you present images is important. And Watchmen Watchmen was intended as a critique of some of the major iconic superheroes and the mythos attached to them. I mean, it's literally a piece of work that is critiquing Captain America, it's critiquing Superman, it's critiquing Batman. It's looking at what those figures really represent. And I felt like it's fundamentally critical of those pieces of work in a way that, I mean, through Snyder's lens, he
made one of those pieces of work.
Yeah, I mean, Rorschach ends up looking like just cool. He shouldn't look cool, you know. He should not look cool. Like, he just looks at this and he sees the dick swagger, you know, as is his want, which made him really the wrong choice for Watchmen, you know.
Who would have been a better choice, you think?
For Watchmen?
Well, someone who's willing to be critical of the medium, yeah.
Well, I don't know. That's really tough because, I mean, I've seen some of the HBO series, and I think that's a smarter adaptation in the sense that instead of just trying to reproduce the graphic novel, it's building on the ideas in it. I think that was a smarter take, in my opinion. But what I struggle with Watchmen is that is one, and this is something that I think is true of a lot of works that get adapted into movies, is that the value of this thing, the way that it works, its mechanics, are so tied to the tools of the medium itself. Like Watchmen has this device where I'm going to try to describe this best as I can, especially as I haven't read this in a few years. But there are moments in Watchmen where the text boxes within the frames are simultaneously giving us narration of what's happening in the present tense scene, but also bits of text box from a comic book within the comic book. And that's just something you can't do in the medium of film.
No.
You really can't. Like, Watchmen's critique of superhero storytelling is built into the way that it's told, which is just something that's impossible to do in the medium of film.
Yeah. And on the other hand, though, we're thinking about bad adaptations and good adaptations. An adaptation I thought was exceptionally well done was Greta Gerwig's Little Women, because that's a text that has been filmed many times. This was probably, the fourth or fifth screen adaptation of that book. But she did do the thing where she put her own stamp on it. But she stayed true to the spirit of the book and the spirit of the character of Jo March that makes people like the character of Jo so much and identify with her over the years. She kept that spirit in there while doing some ambitious things structurally that brought new life to this, often adapted story.
Yeah, I think that's because at a certain point, the question that an audience member is going to have is, why am I watching this instead of just reading the book?
It takes less time.
Well, true. Okay. If you want to set aside that people would probably generally rather watch something than read a book, then that's a nationwide epidemic in its own sense. I do think that's a question that more filmmakers could stand to ask themselves when adapting a work is, what can I bring to this work that makes it valuable on its own?
Right.
And I agree that Little Women is kind of a brilliant adaptation in that respect, in that she kind of rethinks the novel, and she also finds a metatextual layer that works in the sense that she's both adapting that novel and also commenting on the author's life and the author's relationship to it. She's bringing out that, which again, that's a subtext that's there in the writing already, but she is using her own techniques as a filmmaker. She is using things that she's doing through the medium of cinema to underline those elements.
Right.
The old people will say sometimes the best form of film criticism is making a movie, is what people sometimes say.
Interesting.
That the best way to critique another movie is to make one yourself. I sometimes think with adaptations, the best way to offer your analysis of a book is to find an interesting way to adapt it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Little Women really did that. Like you said, it brought out the autobiographical elements of the novel, which is subtext in the novel. And it's subtext in the film to a certain extent too, but she translated it using different tools. I think that's really interesting. You're talking about some works are inextricably tied to their medium, while other works, you can use tools of filmmaking to bring out things that were literary themes in the source material.
Exactly. It's like there's this, sometimes you'll find, the truly great filmmakers, I think, look at a book and they find something in it that is inherently cinematic. They say, this could work as movies. And I think about some of the bad adaptations, some great adaptations of bad books. The two most obvious examples, I think, are both from the 1970s, both new Hollywood guys. But if you look at both The Godfather and Jaws, those are crummy books. I know they're crummy books because I read them when I was a teenager and was falling in love with movies. The movies sort of take those books and say, what in this text is valuable to us or interesting to us, and pull them out. And I think Jaws, especially in the case of that, like, Peter Benchley wrote a book that I think has a lot of images that Spielberg knew that he could bring to the screen, but it also has a bunch of stuff he said, we don't need this. Jaws, there's a whole very minor mafia subplot. There is a whole there's like an affair that happens between the sheriff's wife and Hooper, and you just don't need that stuff. Like, sometimes a good adaptation, and I feel like we've lost this in the years of slavish fidelity, but sometimes a good adaptation says, even in a great book, says what in this book is necessary for the screen adaptation and what can we lose.
Yeah, and on that same note, something we were kind of talking about before we started recording that I thought was really interesting is that novels, like you were saying, it's a process of cutting things down and what are you going to omit? But when you're adapting a short story, you can add.
Yeah, I really think that short stories are underrated as a source of cinematic source material because, it really is a matter of like with a novel, generally, you're picking and choosing what you're going to include. Some novels obviously are short enough that you can include everything in the novel on screen, but that's rarer, honestly, than looking at this brick in your hand and deciding what in it is important and what do we have to preserve. With short stories, I feel like a lot of the time you're extrapolating, you are building on this foundation, and that can be really fascinating. And I also think there are filmmakers who are really good at capturing the vibe of short stories and recognizing that there could be something inherently evocative about a short story and the way that they just kind of throw you into a time and place a lot of the time. I really, one great example I think is Kelly Reichardt's Certain Women, which for me, that is an example of somebody who understands the rhythms of short stories and knows how to bring that to the screen and can make you the kind of ambiguity and mystery of great short fiction is right there in that movie.
Yeah, and the way that she incorporated multiple short stories into one narrative was really expert as well. It's not like it doesn't feel like an anthology film at all.
No, it doesn't. It's well woven together. I think one of the things that a lot of filmmakers run into is that often the reason that we read a book doesn't have that much to do necessarily with the story. I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but books that I was talking to a friend recently, and I was talking about Dune and how I was thinking about finally reading Dune. Maybe before the movie came out, I would read Dune. Just to have it in case I ended up reviewing. I like to do that sometimes. I like to read the source material in advance if I can.
Yeah, me too.
And he was saying it's kind of a real slog to get through because, and his argument was that Herbert the prose just isn't that strong. So the story is cool, but the prose itself is kind of primitive and rudimentary. And I don't know, when I'm reading a novel, like I want to fall in love with the way it's written. It's that Ebert thing again.
Yeah.
It's how this thing is, or it's how this is about, not just what this is about. And I think that a lot of the time the value of a novel it can be inextricable from the way that it's written, from the prose itself, from the form of the book. And in movies, a lot of the time, I feel like it's very difficult to translate the form of a novel to the screen.
Right. And there are certain types of novels that people will call unfilmable. You brought up Dune, simply because, like you said, the first book really is just all set up. The first book of Dune is really just all set up for what happens after that. And that makes it difficult to make a movie of the first book of Dune. And of course, Denis Villeneuve wants to make 2 movies out of that first book of Dune.
Right.
I'm really curious. We haven't had a chance to see that one yet, but I'm really curious how that one goes in terms of what you were talking about, this trend towards being really slavish with the plot detail, because his work can be very evocative, but yeah, Dune is considered, it gets thrown around as a quote unquote unfilmable novel because it's very it gets into a lot of philosophical stuff, big ideas, and like you said, the prose itself isn't all that. And the story itself is kind of secondary to Dune too, because he's really is talking about big ideas, capital B, capital I, big ideas. And so that's one that's thrown around as unfilmable, but people have tried,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there are a lot of sort of towering works of literature that are resistant to adaptation for that very reason. Even something like Moby Dick, which has been adapted a few times, and Moby Dick is obviously exciting. I mean, the core of the novel is they're hunting a fucking whale. That's going to look exciting on screen, but reading Moby Dick, that's not necessarily what pulls you into that novel. So I feel like the adaptations have to kind of give you something different than the pleasures of actually reading it, which, I mean, that's a very digressive book in a lot of ways. It's about,
yes,
about very heavy on detail. Something like Crime and Punishment's another one where Crime and Punishment has been adapted numerous times, but actually reading it is a whole different experience. And I do think that's kind of the ideal approach to adapting something that's traditionally thought of as unadaptable, is try to find the element in it that's cinematic and maybe not try to capture these other elements. But there are works, obviously, that where those other elements are sort of the whole draw of the thing, right?
Right. Like an example I think of that is Naked Lunch. That is a novel that is not about the plot, really.
Right.
It's all digressions, number one, and two, it's a lot of imagery and evocative kind of stuff. I mean, I think David Cronenberg was a really good choice to adapt Naked Lunch because he's really good at disgust, and the overarching feeling of Naked Lunch is a disgusting book, about disgusting people doing depraved things. So I think that he was a good choice to adapt that book. And it's interesting you were saying about digressions. I think that's a big reason why people will call a novel unfilmable, like Tristram Shandy didn't get made into a movie until probably about 10 years ago. I remember writing it up for the Chicago Film Festival catalog. And all the, talk about it was that it was an unfilmable novel because, it wanders quite a bit. And I think Cloud Atlas, it was the same way where the Wachowskis are another good choice for an unfilmable book because they really think radically about storytelling and structure. And so I think that they were a good choice to make that novel into a film.
I'm glad you brought up Tristan Shandy, though, because to me, and I don't know if the adaptation of that is all that successful, to be honest with you.
Right.
But that one is at least one where the filmmaker, Michael Winterbottom, has basically thought about what the value of this work is. And not just its digressive spirit, but also its kind of metatextual elements. And has basically found a way to kind of create a mirror of that in the approach that the film takes itself. There's a lot of like the movie kind of becomes about the act of making a movie about it.
Yes.
And that's very much, I think, in the spirit of that work.
Well, and that brings us to, you mentioned Charlie Kaufman, Adaptation. He made it into a movie about adaptation.
Yeah, that's a very smart one. That's Susan Orlean's The Orchid Thief was the source for that, and it was like I have to imagine this happens all the time in Hollywood, which is somebody has brought a project where it's, you want to talk about unadaptable. Somebody's like, hey, this book was a huge hit. Do you think you could maybe turn that into a movie? And he found a really novel way to do that in turning the whole process of adapting it into the movie itself. Ingenious idea. That's not something you can do every time, though. That's sort of like he got to it, and sorry, everyone, but that movie exists now. You can't do that again.
Oh, that reminds me. This is a bit off topic, but that reminds me of a story I tell all the time about it. When I was a sophomore in college, I took a screenwriting course, and I swear to God, half the people in the class wrote a screenplay about a college student trying to write a screenplay.
Yeah, I mean, can I confess something?
Imagination. Yeah.
Can I confess something? When I was in college, when I was in film school, this is probably 2003, I want to say. Yeah, 2003. I was taking a class at Michigan State University, a filmmaking class, probably my first filmmaking class, in fact. Adaptation had just come out the previous year. And
maybe that's why.
What'd you say?
Maybe that's why, because it was 2004 when I was taking this class. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I feel like it blew people's minds that you could do this, that you could suddenly, it's a very navel-gazing thing in its own way. And I think you kind of have to be a genius like Charlie Kaufman to pull this off, where you're like, I'm going to make this about my process of making it. As Shirley says on Community, in an episode of Community, she says, that sounds very interesting to filmmakers. But
so your confession.
The assignment was to make an autobiographical film. And what I ended up doing was making a autobiographical film that was about me trying to make an autobiographical film.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine how insufferable this thing must be now, especially because, even the notion of doing autobiography alone at that age in my life, like, what the fuck was I going to say about my life,
Right.
I was like 20 years old or something. I didn't know anything about life. But yeah, that was very much my attempt to do adaptation, and not a good one.
Yeah, maybe it really was the time. I hadn't seen Adaptation yet at that time, and I was just like geez, guys, have a little more imagination. But yeah, maybe it was because of the influence of that movie. That's really
has to
interesting.
have been.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I think his work in general is very exciting to budding screenwriters and to budding writers in general. But yeah, I mean, the idea that you could turn the assignment itself into the thing. I mean, honestly, in the movie itself, you can tell that becomes Kaufman's way of not adapting the book in a way. It's like Kaufman says, I can't make a movie out of this, so it has to be about me trying to make a movie out of it. And I think for a student, for example, the notion that somehow this task that's ahead of you can become the meat of what you're making, I think is very attractive, you know? that it's like that I know. You know, I don't know how to adapt this thing, but I sure know how to complain about the fact that I don't know how to adapt it.
Right, exactly. Well, you know, and that whole adolescent thing reminds me of a very famous book that has not yet been attempted to be filmed, which is Catcher in the Rye.
True. Yeah. I think I could be wrong about this. I actually think that's an estate issue.
Yeah.
It's just the rights you've never been allowed to make a movie of it, basically. I do think that any person who eventually does embark on that has their work cut out for them. Even though that's not that's not something like Tristram Shandy or like Naked Lunch or something where there's some sort of element of it that makes it hard to film. I think that has a lot more to do with the interiority thing we were talking about, and also people's just intense relationship to this book as something that they've. Because I mean, the reality is that with a great book or a novel that has sort of entered the canon, everyone who reads it is going to put the movie adaptation of it together in their own mind, and no actual adaptation of it is going to be able to compete with that.
That's true. And well, the other example I had here is, you know, a classic unfilmable novel for style reasons, and that's Ulysses, the James Joyce novel. Like, what happens in Ulysses? I couldn't fucking tell you.
Right.
It was 500 pages long. Right. And I read it when I was in college and very, like, you know, determined to be erudite or whatever.
I do think that's adaptation proof as well. And I think that's another example, like Watchmen, honestly, of a piece of work that is the value of it is so tied to the medium in which it exists that an adaptation would kind of probably miss the point.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
If anything, I think if you got tasked with making an adaptation of Ulysses, I think the best thing to do would be to only do part of it, not try to do the whole book.
Yeah. Like
pick a certain part of the book and focus on that and make it really like surreal and digressive and work in all that structural stuff into the story. You know, sort of a similar idea to doing a focused biopic instead of your sort of generic biopic, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Like pick and choose what you're going to cover in this work. And maybe, I mean, honestly, if anybody ever attempts Ulysses, and I'm not sure anybody ever will, I think the best approach might be to not think about how faithful you can be to this, to actually think about like what in this work could be cinematic, and who cares if it resembles the book that much, so long as it's in the spirit of the book. You know,
right? Exactly.
I'm excited abstractly by the notion of a filmmaker trying to find some sort of match in their own medium for a quality that's in the writing. You know, is there something about the writing that can be replicated through a different language, through a different sort of stylistic language? Well, I think one of the better adaptations, to my mind, that just leaps to mind is No Country for Old Men, which I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that is so plainly, starkly written in a lot of ways by Cormac McCarthy that it lends itself immediately to adaptation, but also the way that the Coen brothers sort of key in on how laser focused that is, and how stark it is, and sort of replicate not just its philosophy but kind of its rhythm too.
Well, let's dive into a book that we have both read from an author who we've already cited as accessible, but I would argue this is one of his less adaptable works because of a few different things. Let's talk about Stephen King's It. Now, number one, it's an extremely long book. It was completely justified to split it up into two parts. Number two, the
1,200
structure
pages.
of it is... Yeah. Number two, it's the structure of the book itself is very repetitive. You know, part one and part two, you have different chapters, and each one is told from a perspective of a different one different member of the Losers Club, and their specific encounters with it and, Pennywise the Clown, whatever you want to call it. And so that is something that kind of is challenging in terms of making a linear narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason this started as a miniseries, honestly, because, I mean, obviously there's the 1990 miniseries, which is, something like 4 hours. And I think that makes sense in terms of trying to tackle the sheer sprawling breadth of this novel. But it's more than just the length of it. It really is. It's a matter of structure because, again, you do have that kind of back and forth, which I think I've always said is so crucial to what that book does for us as a reader that, well, it's totally understandable that somebody would that the movie adaptations would split it in two. For those who don't know, it is about a group of children in small town Maine who basically are grappling with, beyond just the general troubles of childhood, they're grappling with an ageless demon clown that is hunting them. And the book takes place over really about, I think, 27 years is the span of it. Yeah,
every 27 years, it comes back,
Exactly. So there are a number of scenes set in the 1950s, and then there are scenes set in the early 1980s as well. And the book sort of takes this non-chronological approach where it's jumping back and forward in time. Really, again, thematically crucial to what that novel is about, which I think is childhood trauma and how it seeps into the present and how we are the children that we were. We are always those kids. We just get older and bigger, and how the present collapses into the past. The non-chronological structure is crucial to the way the novel works, and they do not preserve it in the films, obviously.
No, they make it... linear narrative, and they cut out a lot of kind of the side stuff from the book, which I think in one instance it helped. Like, I didn't think we really needed all the stuff with Beverly Marsh and her abusive husband in the movie so much. There's some pretty violent, upsetting scenes in the book with that I honestly was not sad to have left out of the book. But then there is the whole thing with the fire that they cut out of the book that I think really, there's one of the characters, Mike. He's sort of the unofficial historian of the group. He's the one who's like stayed in town and is gathering all this evidence, to try to defeat this thing once and for all. And there's an interlude in the book that does that non-chronological thing you were talking about, where there's a fire at a place called the Black Spot, which is a bar that was frequented by the Black community in this town, and it gets burnt down. And it really ties into all that, historical trauma stuff that you were talking about and cycles of history. And they left it out of the movie, and I think the movie was a little poorer for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a ton of stuff like that in the book too. I mean, the book kind of functions like it sort of doubles, in fact, as a history of a fictional place. It's like Derry is this prototypical small town in America. So part of what you're getting throughout the book is you're getting a history of this place. And you're seeing how over the years certain patterns have repeated themselves, how the image of a perfect American town, how much that's a lie, and how much of what really goes on underneath is important to understanding what this book is really about. And I completely understand why they lost that. That stuff wouldn't even necessarily work in the movie itself. Even an adaptation of this, and I honestly do think that we'll probably eventually get another adaptation of this, and it'll probably be for television. I think we'll get a longer miniseries, and it'll probably try to be more comprehensive, and it'll get a lot of that other stuff in there. I don't know if that stuff would really play on the screen, to be honest. I think it would feel needlessly digressive when in fact it's totally crucial to what the book is doing.
I mean, that is fair, but I mean, I do feel like, in the book I feel like he's making kind of a statement on America and the way that we just like to conveniently forget all the bad things that have happened, in history, and then those cycles end up repeating themselves. And you take that out, and it is, it's a good horror story about some kids and a immortal demon clown, but it is just a story about some kids and an immortal demon clown,
Yeah, no, the movie definitely it's a Cliff Notes version, and beyond that, it turns a very serious examination and a very thoughtful examination, I think, of child trauma, of generational trauma, of America itself. It turns it into kind of a funhouse ride. Another critic I know referred to it as his name's Matt Lynch. He referred to it as serious Beetlejuice. Which is, I think, pretty fucking spot on, to be honest.
Serious Beetlejuice. That's funny. That's good.
Yeah.
I mean, and well, let's address the elephant in the sewer. I'm glad they left out the infamous child orgy from the book.
Yeah, that's a really that's maybe a misjudged element of the book. I mean, I feel like it is the type of book where, at its length and at the, like with the commitment that you have going into it, you kind of forgive the fact that it's a pretty imperfect piece of work as well. That
right.
There's
sure.
a lot of bagginess to it in general, and that's kind of part of the whole appeal of it. That is the one section of the book where I'm like, he maybe should have rethought this. I get its value in the what it's trying to do in the context of the book.
Weird.
It's gross and weird, and I don't know that it works, and I wasn't sad to see it gone either, especially because in a lot of ways it does. I do feel like that book is about this camaraderie that develops between these kids and how all of them are united by this trauma and united by their, in some respects, feeling like misfits and feeling different from those around them. And then it kind of others Beverly further. It draws a line between her and the other kids in a way that I think is kind of gross and misjudged.
Yeah, I agree. And well, you were talking about the book being kind of baggy. I mean, that book is a great example of something where it's greater than the sum of its parts.
Yep.
I think if you take any one part of it, there's a lot of like, what the fuck is going on here with that book? But like as a whole, it makes those bigger statements that we were talking about.
Yeah, there's a real cumulative power to it. I agree with you that when you finish that, you feel like you've experienced something. You know,
yeah.
I'm very close to this novel in a lot of ways, and I've written about personal aspects of it that I've found in the work, and it was impossible for me, I think, to watch these movies and not constantly see how it wasn't the book. It wasn't this thing that I'd grown up with and loved, and it wasn't this thing that spoke to me, that it was just this different thing. So I was I was very grateful that you ended up doing those reviews for us when we were when the movies came out, and we needed reviews for both of them, obviously. I was very grateful because I actually felt way too close to this thing to write about it in a fair way, honestly. At least in the form of a review, you know.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is that, I just read the book like a couple years before the movie came out, maybe the year before. I was like, oh, I should finally get around to this, brick of a book. And so I did, kind of with an eye towards reviewing it eventually. And even without that personal connection, I remember when I wrote the review for It Chapter 2, you telling me, well, this is a review of the movie. It's not an essay about how the movie's different from the book. I still felt very tempted to just talk about the book and how it wasn't the book in the review, even without that, like, I suppose, more personal connection to the material.
Well, but that's the danger, though, right? I mean, that's the danger anytime. I mean, I said earlier in the show that I sometimes like to read the source material before I see a movie that I'm reviewing, and you said you do the same. That's kind of a double-edged sword, though, a little bit, because I do feel like if your review turns into just how this thing is different than the book, then you're not really necessarily engaging with what they made out of it. And it's I think it's a natural instinct, especially when you spend so much time with a book. A movie, any movie that you watch, I mean, even the longest movies are not going to take more than a day of your life. Whereas a novel, you live with that thing, especially a novel as big as it. That's true. This thing is something that you live with until you finish it. So it kind of sets, I think, some pretty tough expectations for the filmmaker that they're going to live up to whatever relationship you have to this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, you can't read the book for every single review that you do because, like you said, so many movies are based on books. Yeah. But right now, I just got Killers of the Flower Moon, and I want to read that before the Scorsese movie
nice.
comes out.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads to a question. So this is something that I wanted to talk about. Is there a book that you would really like to see get adapted for the screen?
Okay, I have a couple. I'm going to say, okay, cool. I'm a big fan of Michael Chabon's The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. Mm-hmm. I really love that novel. And I actually think that there is a filmmaker who could really do that thing justice. And I think it's Wes Anderson.
Interesting.
I think Anderson is a perfect match to that material. Yeah. I mean, that's another one where I think you would have to lose things in translation. I think that some of the richer stuff about the comic book industry and some of the sort of comic stories within the story, I think would be hard to do in film form, although you could easily, there could be stories within the story. I think that whoever makes that, I think that they would be wise to think about changes they could make to this thing. As much as they might hurt, as much as deviating from such a beloved book would hurt some fans, I think thinking about how to make this thing more cinematic would be great. My expectation is that if we ever do see a Cavalier and Clay adaptation, I think it's going to be for television. It just feels like the type of thing where that will be a miniseries before it's a movie, I think. But I still think it could be a killer movie as well.
Yeah. Well, Anderson would be a good choice too, because like he's really good at that chapter-based kind of storytelling, and that works for the story within the story thing that you were talking about.
It really does, and I think that he could. There's a kind of there's this kind of aesthetic quality to the book where you can tell that the characters as well as the writer are obsessed with comic books, but beyond that with just the kind of aesthetic qualities of the world, and I mean that's Anderson in a nutshell, you know. I just when I realized that he was that for me would be a dream project. I would really love to see him make that movie. I don't, you know, obviously he probably won't, but I think that would be remarkable.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things getting adapted for TV, actually a book that I always kind of wondered why it didn't get adapted, because I really liked it, which was Octavia Butler's Kindred. That book, it was very influential on the movie Antebellum. Like, that movie goes in a different direction, but it starts with the same basic premise as Kindred. It's a book about a woman from the 20th century, a black woman, she's a black person, who gets transported back in time to the 19th century. And when I read it, I had never considered before. I read it probably 10, 15 years ago. I mean, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but, you know, the limits of my perspective as a white person, I had never considered how fraught it would be to go into the past if you weren't white before. I had never thought about that. And it's just a really good book. It's one of my favorite books. And they're like I said, it was influential on Antebellum, which was not a good movie. But now they're making an FX series with it. And Janicza Bravo, who directed Zola, is going to direct the FX adaptation. So I'm optimistic about that one.
That's exciting.
Yeah. And, well, speaking of big popular novels, I'm honestly surprised that they never made a Geek Love movie. Why has there never been a Geek Love movie? Geek Love is a novel that came out in 1989. It kind of kick-started the trend in sideshows. You know how like sideshows were kind of trendy in the 90s for a while, and that sort of a freak show aesthetic? This book really kicked that off, and it came out in 89. It's a novel about a family of circus freaks who you find out over time there's like a patriarch in the family, and he's like very abusive and stuff, and they're not genetic freaks, if you dig what I'm saying. He uses like chemicals to kind of create mutants. And it's a really good book. It's another one of my favorite books. But Tim Burton expressed interest in it back in the 90s, which makes sense. You know, that was very much in line with his kind of aesthetic at the time. His aesthetic's a little different now. Yeah. But also, speaking of the Wachowskis, they expressed interest, and I think they would be an interesting fit too, because of their interest in kind of transhumanism. And I think that would be an interesting fit for them too. And Warner Brothers owns the rights in perpetuity. They're just sitting on the rights to this book, and I don't know why they never did it. For sure, the subject matter is grotesque, but like I said, David Cronenberg exists. Well, so right. What's the issue?
I mean, I've never read it, and this is the first time hearing about it, but that sounds very up Burton's alley. And
Yeah.
I mean, Burton obviously maybe he got some of that out of his system when he did Dumbo finally, which has
Yeah.
at least circus elements in it, But he has a talent for making their grotesque kind of cuddly in its own way. So it feels like it.
And that's how the book is.
Right. So maybe get on it, Warner Brothers. Just make it happen.
Why? I just don't know why they've been sitting on these rights for 30 years.
Totally.
I don't get it. But you had another one that you wanted to see.
Yeah, I have just one more. I would say that I've always wanted to see an adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's Nick Adams stories. Which I think would again. I mean, this sort of falls in line with my belief that short stories are an underrated source material for movies. And the Nick Adams stories are ones that he wrote that are sort of loosely autobiographical, based on a lot of things that happened in his life. The stories themselves are kind of sad and mysterious and ominous, and I think that you could make a really interesting film that just kind of strung together some of these vignettes from his life, a kind of almost a kind of stealth Hemingway autobiography that was through these fictionalized stories about his life. Because it follows the character from his childhood into eventually he goes to war. There is some very powerful material about suicide in it, obviously, which will of course resonate with Hemingway's story in a very sad way. Mm-hmm. But I think that somebody could make a really fucking dynamite movie out of, if they stayed true to the kind of episodic nature of those stories and sort of hanging on to the mystery and the pathology of them. I think you could make a great movie. And
I mean, some of the working in the stuff about the author too, it reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with Little Women, the way Greta Gerwig did it. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yep. Oh, and the other thing about Hemingway is that he writes in a way that's very, very easy to visualize. I mean, he has that
exactly. Yeah, he's famous for that. Yeah,
that famously stark, simple style that you could practically copy and paste into Final Draft and have the screenplay for this thing.
Call it a screenplay.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. The descriptive text is basically script text. So.
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
Well, we have been giving Little Women a lot of praise today for finding a fresh perspective on well-worn material. But, I kind of posed the question earlier of what's something that you would never want to see adapted, either again or ever. And you said A Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
Because you don't think that there's anything left to say about it.
Well, so far as I know, it might be the most adapted single story. I guess there might be some.
I think it's Sherlock Holmes.
Oh yeah, well that makes
adapted.
Sense.
Yeah,
but Sherlock Holmes is a character with many stories. A Christmas Carol is just a Christmas Carol.
Right. Yes.
Maybe Dracula beats it. I don't know. But in the case of Dracula, often that's just the character. Though there have been several adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel. A lot of the time, you're also just inserting Dracula into other stories. I don't feel like you get that a lot with A Christmas Carol. It's not like Scrooge shows up in other stories. It is just every time A Christmas Carol. And, we've seen a number of brilliant actors as Scrooge. We've seen the story told again and again. We've seen it in an animated form. We've seen it. We've seen a spoof of it. We've seen several spoofs of it. We've seen it updated to modern times. We've seen it with the fucking Muppets,
Yeah. I like that one, though.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. And I actually like a lot of the adaptations, but the thing is, it's been done. I don't think, as timeless as the story may be, I don't think we need another adaptation of it, and I don't feel like we've gotten to a point where anybody is finding new nuance in this story or new notes. It's always going to be kind of the same thing, let's let it go. Except for maybe if they did a feature-length version of the I Think You Should Leave sketch, the where Scrooge fights the Bonies from the ghost of Way, Way Future. That I would watch.
Well, yeah. Well, we'd have to bring Ray Harryhausen back for the dead for that one.
Exactly. All right, what's your pick?
My pick is actually for a different reason. Similar to Catcher in the Rye, Gabriel Garcia Marquez specifically refused to sell the film rights for 100 Years of Solitude. Now, Love in the Time of Cholera was made into a movie in 2007, which I believe was after Marquez died. But still, there has still never been a film of 100 Years of Solitude. It has a lot of the issues or characteristics that we were talking about that make a novel quote unquote unfilmable. It's big scope. It also uses a lot of repetition. But that being said, we have talked about some examples of films that have risen to that challenge. And also that book was a big I don't know if it was the first magical realist novel, but it definitely helped popularize the idea of magical realism. And magical realism works really well in film, I think. I think film is really well suited to that type of storytelling. But that being said, it's like I respect Robert Zemeckis never allowing Back to the Future to be remade either. Like, I think if the creator doesn't want it to be adapted, then we can respect that.
I love the idea of honoring those feelings. My fear is that eventually everything passes into public domain.
Yes.
So eventually we probably will get an adaptation, but it would be nice if people just said, he didn't want one, maybe leave it alone,
Yeah, but you're right. We'll get a 100 Years of Solitude, post-apocalyptic gritty version of it. That's all we've got for you this week. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was edited and mixed by Zack Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Stay tuned next week. We'll be talking about the 2021 Toronto International Film Festival. Thanks, folks.
Bye.